Then in the next section from 129 to 140, notice how the doctor projects scenarios, but when he gets to the point at 135, having projected a kind of scenario, he very clearly says, but you're not. No, you're very young for all of this. And we will want to push you through another 40 years. So notice here the important evidence, emphasis on longevity. Why am I introducing this entire consultation? I'm doing so because I think if we want to look at creativity, it's not enough to look at that kind of single moment of what we believe to be creative talk. We have to see it as a trajectory that goes over a whole period. And at a certain moment, the opportunity arrives to do something creative. When I was working with psychotherapeutic patients with borderline personality disorder, the discursive characteristics of their talk is that it's monotonous, it's iterative, talks about everyday things in a monotonous, unvariegated prosody. But there are suddenly certain moments when this changes. And when I talked to the therapists, what they were saying was, it's at those windows, and that's how they define it. It's those windows in which we can, as it were, creatively intervene. So at a certain moment in this long, rather undifferentiated, monotonous, mundane recounting experiences, the patient said, the patient said at one point, and we went to the beach. And there was a certain pause, a raising of the prosody, as it were, at that moment. And at that moment, the professional said something which allowed him to do what he wanted to do, which is creatively open the window, so that he could then hope that the patient subsequently would talk in a more animated and person-related way, at least for a period of time. And they saw that as a very clear expertise, which they had in those kinds of interactions. If we go on to the next part, again, you have a continuation of risk talk, the introduction now of time frame talk, which has been introduced before. And then we get in this penultimate extract on line 161, the doctor says, going back to the quantitative data about risk from before, suggests that your risk is about 50% over a 5 to 10 year period of this returning in the breast. Notice now that the time frame has now much reduced from 40 years or whatever it was before, now to a much narrower kind of time frame. And then the patient says, that's after radiation. Correct, right. And you would then need a mastectomy to treat that. Interestingly, the doctor has built up gradually the notion that time is now becoming more important, and that there are courses of action which are important as a result of this curtailment of time. And what's more, he set up, which he hadn't before, the idea that one course of action, which had started off as being an option, mastectomy, now, as it were, becomes more salient, because even if the other option had been taken up, it isn't the case that mastectomy would necessarily be, as it were, obviated. And so it's important that that is introduced at this time. It's extremely skillful talk. You would then need a mastectomy, the first time that that's been, in fact, said. And then you get, doctor, but 50% is not 100%. No. And it's not uncommon for women to sit where you're sitting and say, I don't, you know, I'm prepared to take a 50% chance. I desperately want to keep my breast. Patient says, I'm not that desperate. That's what I needed to get a sense of. Now, I think that this is extremely skillful, creative choice of resources, because you have a critical moment in this particular crucial interaction. The critical moment about making a decision about a form of treatment which is, after all, very invasive, and much less invasive than the one that was being offered initially as a kind of option. And so what's happening now in this critical moment is to make immediate treatment recommendations. So I think you should have so in this critical moment, the doctor has certain choices that he can make. He could say, I think you should have a mastectomy, how do you feel about that? Or he could say, how do you feel about a mastectomy? Or he could do what he does here, where he reformulates, as it were, a strategic question without asking a question. That's what he does in line 173. But in line 171, what he does is to present what is now increasingly not an option, but in a way in which he voices this from the point of view of the patient, thus, as it were, taking himself out of what would otherwise be a categorical decision by the doctor, this is what you should do. So what we get then in this particular whole interaction is a very skillful management of the strategic resources, culminating at this particular point. The doctor indicating that he's about to counter expectations created by a co-constructed medical evidence, by choosing different voices to shift from the medical to life world discourse, and to use direct quotation as a strategic choice. Notice the stress on "I desperately want to keep my breath," where he's voicing like an actor, so to speak, the views of the particular patient. And so what you get is a shift from the professional discourse to the personal discourse and voice. And you switch, if you like, to what is, in fact, a kind of drama-like interaction.